Hey folks, it's Miss Sinclair for AP World History, and today we are going to continue our Unit 3 lectures on land empires. We are going to be talking specifically about political changes in Europe. So for your bell work, what has been the economic system of Europe during the medieval period? Our topic is 3.2, looking at political change in Europe. So this aligns with topic 3.2 of your AP course description, looking at the administration of empires. So you will be able to explain how rulers used a variety of methods to legitimize and consolidate their power in Europe. So let's start by talking about social and economic life. It is during this time period we have the emergence of the bourgeoisie, a French word that means sort of middle class, propertied people. Nowadays, and this is in part because of the term bourgeoisie and its association with communism, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, as outlined by Karl Marx, we associate bourgeoisie with rich. So I know it's even been a slang term recently in the last couple of years of saying like, oh, like that's so bougie, right? It's ritzy, it's over the top, luxurious, right? This is not quite what we mean when we talk about the bourgeoisie in the 15th and 16th centuries. In early modern Europe, the bourgeoisie is going to be a class of sort of well-off city dwellers whose wealth will come from manufacturing, finance, commerce, and the professions associated with those. Basically, the bourgeoisie are these sort of middle-class people who have some money, they live in cities, and they're not working in agriculture. So as cities grow with more trade, people within these cities grow in their profession, their wealth, and the number of people who would fall into this category grows as well. So trade allows for the emergence of new economic and political elites. And we're seeing that trade is really going to be huge for Europe during this time period. In Holland, aka the Netherlands, aka where the Dutch live, we see a commercial revolution. This is what's known as the Dutch Golden Age. So we will talk about the Protestant Reformation next. However, in general, you should know that Protestantism views the involvement in commerce more favorably than Catholicism does. So when Holland starts to shift away from the Catholic Church and starts to become a much more dominantly Protestant community, we see a massive increase in consumerism and wealth. And this wealth is in turn spent on art, clothing, and food. So you see the creation of factories that do weaving, process cloth, so it can be made into clothes, printing of patterns on cloth. And because Holland has no censorship laws, unlike many other European states, it has an incredibly large publishing industry. So across Europe, and in fact across the world, due to the discovery of the Americas and the mining done in the Americas, we see a huge influx of gold and especially silver into the global economy. This causes inflation, and production really is not going to be able to keep pace with wealth. So this means we have the creation of very strong banks. We also have the creation of trading companies. So trading companies were generally backed by the government, but completely unregulated. So what does that mean? It means the government gives them funding, but doesn't tell them what to do at all. Great examples of these would be the Dutch East India Trading Company, the British East India Trading Company. So a joint stock company, which I believe I'm going to define on the next, a joint stock company is simply a business backed by a government charter that sold shares to individuals to raise money for its trading enterprises and to spread the risks and profits among many investors. So we see that with the joint stock companies, with this increase in trade, both sort of internationally and regionally, we see prosperity increases for ordinary people. Europe's merchants really rely on family and ethnic networks at this time. So you have these large joint stock companies like the Dutch East India or the Dutch West India companies. East Indies is like Indonesia, West Indies is the Caribbean. So we see private investors with trade monopolies will pay annual fees to France and England to do trade with their colonies. And the reason why you have this need for investment is because it's still very risky. You have risks involved with this trade because of competition with other European states for profits. There is the risk of pirates, of extortion, of disaster, just like a hurricane coming and destroying all of your goods. So it makes sense that these large companies want to spread the risk across multiple investors, both the government and individuals. So it is out of these government charters and out of the way that individuals can invest in these government charters that you start to see the rise of stock exchanges and people being able to invest directly into companies. So the Amsterdam Exchange is one of these early ones. You also see an investment in infrastructure. So in Holland, in the Netherlands, you see the government investing in canals. They really drain the lowlands for agriculture. So the Netherlands is actually going to dramatically increase their land territory because so much of it should be underwater. So much of Holland's land is actually below sea level, and they've drained it and use seawalls and dikes to keep the land dry and arable. So the Dutch are really getting competition from the British in regard to trade. And eventually economic competition will turn into war. Over time, we see that the bourgeoisie, these wealthy merchants and city dwellers, will start to leverage their wealth to become part of the gentry, to become part of the nobility, the upper class. So you still have a distinction between like wealthy merchants and like dukes and lords and all of that stuff. So some of the ways that they do this might be to marry their children into royal houses, right? Noble houses, especially if those noble houses are kind of broke. Here, marry my daughter. She's super rich. And then all of a sudden you have access to these social circles that you didn't have before. So this is a great one. This is optional, but if you really want to understand merchant capitalism, actually no, I do want you to watch this one. I want you to watch it up to the hidden compartment, please. So what about poor people, right? What about our peasants? Well, we see during this time period really the disappearance of serfdom. Remember, because of the Black Death and the subsequent peasant uprisings, feudalism and serfdom is on the way out. One of the things we see is that although you no longer have serfs in Western Europe, right? And we know how close that line was between serfdom and slavery. Although Europe is no longer relying on serfs as the foundation of their economic prosperity, it is not right to say that like everything is free and clear and like you have a free and bustling economy. Europe is going to continue to depend on unfree labor for its economic prosperity. However, now this unfree labor is taking the form of chattel slavery in its colonies. Now, these might be colonies in the Americas or in the West Indies. In the West Indies, it's not so much chattel slavery, but it is still slavery. It is still oppression. So Western Europe is no longer oppressing really its own peasants so much, but it's oppressing other people in their colonies, and the wealth and prosperity that it's going to enjoy is because of this unfree labor in the colonies. One of the other things we see impacting peasants and agriculture during this time period is what's known as the Little Ice Age. So the exact dates of the Little Ice Age are a little bit debated. Generally, they're considered to range from the 16th to the 19th century. So that means the 1500s to the 1800s. However, some experts will say it starts earlier than that it starts in the 1300s with the Black, like sort of aligning with the Black Death. It's not exact. However, we do see a distinct shift, right? You have this medieval warm period, and then you have a distinctive cooling period. And one theory as to why this has happened is because of the massive deforestation and slash and burn agriculture happening in the Americas prior to the arrival of the Spaniards. And then after the arrival of the Spaniards in 1492 and Europeans in general, the massive loss of life due to pandemics, smallpox, and general disruption, oppression, and violence, you no longer have this massive deforestation. Thus, meaning less ash and carbon is being released into the atmosphere. And so this human cause of global warming ends, causing a cooling period. Either way, you see this has a huge impact on agriculture. And in fact, an increase in witch hunts, which is interesting because we've talked about this before. Because when things in the natural world are happening that you can't understand, whether it's like plague or all of your crops keep failing, you have a desire to assign blame somewhere. And one of the places blame was assigned was to this idea of witches. We'll talk about it more later. So you also have, during this time period, new crops being introduced to Europe, specifically crops from the Americas. Potatoes and maize, aka corn, really become staples for the rural poor. They will grow and export wheat, but won't be able to afford to eat it. We see that there is some industry still in mining, lumberjacks, and charcoal maker. So you take wood, you burn it a little bit, and now you have charcoal. So because of an increased iron industry, you have an increased need for coal, for mining, but this also leads to increased deforestation. So we do see social uprisings during this time period as well. People without access to wealth-producing property, as well as increased population pressure and rising food prices, will create social tension. When you introduce new ideas of equality with the Enlightenment, you start to have a population who's dissatisfied with the status quo. So we see an increase in the very poor during this time period. So rebellions are very common. They're never going to be massive and at this point not successful, but it would be common to be having rebellions throughout your nation pretty frequently. And the leaders would be caught executed or maimed as a warning to future rebellions. What about women? Well, women still have really few rights. And again, your life experience really depends on your wealth. However, widows can control property and assets. In general, young men and women in early modern Europe would be able to choose their own spouses unless you were super rich or royal, right? A princess is not going to be able to choose who she marries. But like a random farmer, yeah, go ahead, pick your husband or pick your wife. We see as well that young men and women are marrying later in life. And by later in life, I mean like in their 20s, middle 20s or later 20s, often because of work. They had to save up so they could live independently of their parents. Doesn't that sound familiar? So we do see changes to the family dynamic in Europe in this time. We see religious change will prompt a greater concentration on family life with Protestantism. The Enlightenment in general encourages marriages based off of love instead of convenience or more business-like motivations. So the combination of these two things really raises the status of women. We see a later marriage, and this also, of course, will mean to a drop in birth rates, right? If you're getting married a little bit later in life, you're having fewer babies. But in general, we see a change in attitudes towards children, an emphasis on the nuclear family, parents and children, as opposed to the extended family or the greater community. We see an increase in educational toys and books among the bourgeoisie. Schools start to be established for children. So boys in particular among the bourgeoisie would be educated in the classics and multiple languages, so they would be able to do business on a global scale. Women would have less formal education, but would still be able to read, and some women would become painters, writers, musicians. But in general, both of these things would be only for the bourgeoisie and up. If you're a poor peasant, you're not learning how to read, if you're male or female. So, one of the things we will see rising up during this time period is the rise of wars of religion. Remember, I said that Europe is constantly at war with each other and itself. This is going to be motivated in part because of religion. So, like I said, we are going to talk about the Protestant Reformation a little bit later. So because of that, I'm going to actually not go into these next couple slides. I'm going to talk about them in the context of the Protestant Reformation. So you can just ignore these slides I'm going past very quickly, knowing that I will return to them, I promise. Okay, let's pick up here. So let's talk about political innovations then. We see that starting with the late medieval period and the Renaissance, you have the rise of these significant kings. In France, you have Louis XIV. He is quoted as saying, "I am the state." And so he is a prime example of absolutism. Absolutism is a political theory that absolute complete power should be vested in one or more rulers. So what does that mean? It means absolute monarchs have complete control of everything. So Louis XIV is a great example of an absolutist monarch. One of the things we see absolute monarchs doing is demonstrating their wealth and their power. And one of the ways that they do this is by building up monumental architecture like the Palace of Versailles, or by becoming patrons of the arts. If you remember, early steps were made towards checking the power of the monarch in France by establishing the Estates General, where you had like the church, the nobles, and the peasants. However, what Louis XIV is going to do is he's going to stop convening the Estates General and pass his own laws. He will send bureaucrats to the provinces if they disagree with him, and he will start to invest in state-run manufacturing, promote an internal economy to improve tax revenues, so to fund his wars, and will really start to limit the imports from other nations, instead using the colonies to provide raw materials. So we see absolute monarchies also being set up in Prussia, Spain, and Austria-Hungary. So these are a couple pictures of Versailles. Sorry, that one's super pixelated. Just Google search Versailles. You'll see some gorgeous pictures. The famous Hall of Mirrors, of course. And this is an illustration of what Versailles would have looked like in his age. So watch this video, please. It will give you a good sense of absolutism and Louis XIV in particular. It's kind of fun. So what is absolutism? What are the characteristics of absolutism? Well, it's really an extension of monarchical power. And we see it really emerging between 1650 and 1750, generally. We see it in France, Prussia, Russia, Austria, Hungary, and Sweden. And it will provide the foundations for a modern centralized state. So in many ways, European kings will benefit from the Protestant Reformation because the Catholic Church will lose a lot of its political power, and secular rulers will be able to then assert their authority. They will expand the government, taxation, the military, and in fact, religious orthodoxy. So your king will impact the lives of ordinary people much more than ever before. They will also seek to really limit the traditional power of nobles and towns, essentially anyone who might be a threat to their own power. And in many of these places, having had about a century of religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics, these absolute monarchs will seek to restore public order. So what are the characteristics of an absolutist king? First one is divine right. It's this idea that rulers often use religious ideas and institutions to justify their rule. So why am I king? Because God chose me to be king. I am ordained by God to be king. So you should listen to me, because if you're not listening to me, you're not listening to God. We see the use of a strong and professional army. So what does that mean? Well, when someone attacks, you don't just say like, tell your neighbors, grab your pitchforks, but you have soldiers whose career it is to be soldiers, who are trained to fight and use artillery. You see high taxes used to support wars and the use of bureaucracies to govern their states. Think about what we talked about with Peter the Great and Catherine in Russia. So, actually, I'm not done yet. So many of our absolutist kings are going to be very ambitious. They are going to seek to add to their land and prestige through advantageous marriages, inheritance, warfare, and treaties. And nobles will accept this authority in exchange for status of their own, right? They will seek to take advantage of this system to maximize their own power and authority in land, as well as privileges over the peasants who live on the land. So since the king dispensed and monitored titles, like you displease me, you're no longer a duke, I'm making this other guy a duke, it really is going to ensure obedience to the king. The king will also expand the authority of the state within territory by increasing the government officials, by increasing taxes, and by sometimes persecuting religious minorities. We see this especially in religious states. So the monarchs would often have a close relationship with the church, often influencing the appointments of priests and bishops and cardinals and such like that. So one example of this absolutist system would be in the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire is going to be found in what's sort of known as Germany, Austria, Hungary, this whole region. And really, it's not one single unified state. It's over 300 autonomous political entities. So you will hear us talk about like the German princes during the Protestant Reformation, like the King of Prussia. Well, Prussia is part of the Holy Roman Empire. You have these internal states that are governed, and then of course there is a emperor who is ultimately in charge. And the emperor is going to come from the Habsburg family. So the Habsburgs are a whole powerful European family that will provide many emperors to the Holy Roman Empire, but also to other European states and marriages. So remember, the Holy Roman Empire really started with Charlemagne, and it will always have a sort of tense relationship between the emperor and princes. Princes will always assert their own independence and never really paid that much to the emperor's authority. However, with the Habsburgs, they're going to try and take much more of that control. So they were really the wealthiest landowners in the empire due to extensive dynastic marriages, and will be married into every royal house in Western Europe. So Charles V is really the best of the Habsburgs. He is technically the heir to the Habsburg, Burgundian, and Spanish kingdoms. So technically will control much of the New World as well. He will try to really unify Germany and then will fail. But he is the leading monarch of his age. And as he likes to say, I speak Spanish to God, Italian to women, French to men, and German to my horse. So this era is really going to be defined by three continuous conflicts. An internal one, wars between the Habsburgs, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Ottomans, right? It's Charles V who will stop the Ottomans from taking Vienna. And then, of course, the Protestant Reformation. But here's what we all remember about the Habsburgs. Is their incest. They had a tendency to try and keep the bloodline pure, to marry into each other. And since they were married into every royal household in Europe, it was hard to avoid that. So the joke is, of course, that the Habsburg family tree looks more like a wreath. But I mean, look at it. By the time you get to the end here, this one, gosh, why can't I remember his name? He was a Spanish king. I think Philip, perhaps. His mother, and his father, was also his father was also his mother's uncle, right? And her parents were his sister and then her uncle. It's not great. So you see like the characteristic Habsburg chin, and it's because of these recessive genes. By the end, by the last one, after he died, they did an autopsy and are like, oh wow, yeah, his brain is like completely smooth. He is actually unable to really speak, reproduce. If you actually read his autopsy, I'm pretty sure it's King Philip of Spain. He is not a well man. Incest does not strengthen your family line, actually. So what about in England? Well, in England, you have a parliamentary monarchy, right? This is a key difference between what England is doing and what the rest of Europe is doing. So the rest of Europe is becoming absolutist monarchs. Well, in England, you have a parliamentary system, which means you have a check on the king. The king has to share power with representatives from the nobility and the upper urban classes. Well, this will ultimately lead to a civil war because King Charles I doesn't want to have his power checked. He wants to be an absolutist monarch. So he doesn't call the parliament for 11 years. And when he does call them, it's just because he has to raise taxes. During that time, Parliament tries to pass a law that says you can't ignore us. He refuses to sign over that law, and thus a civil war ensues. So the English Civil War is a conflict between royal and parliamentary rights, caused by Charles I ultimately arresting his critics, and ends with his critics executing him. So it's really an assertion of Parliament's power over the British monarchy. And the outcome is really going to check the growth of royal absolutism in England. It will ensure that England will continue to be a constitutional monarchy. So, what happens next? Well, after Charles, you don't have really a king for a while. You have Oliver Cromwell ruling with the Puritans, who, and he's also going to be unwilling to share power. So then they put a king back in charge, James II, but he is super Catholic, which after Henry VIII, England's not Protestant, and he's going to ignore Parliament as well. So with the Glorious Revolution, they get rid of James and install William and Mary. It's William of Orange, he's a Dutch guy, and then Mary, one of Charles's daughters. And with the crowning of William and Mary, they also sign into effect the Act of Supremacy. So the Act of Supremacy says that Parliament has power essentially over the king. So what is the significance of this? Well, it means that you have the right to revolution, right? You have the right to fight your king. It means that monarchs should be restrained by institutions that protect the public. It really ensures the power of Parliament over the king, and it also means political groups can compete for influence. Oh, I just said all that. The Enlightenment is going to emerge out of the Protestant Reformation as well as the English Civil War in many ways. So, take a moment to answer these questions. What are some of the characteristics of absolutism? Who is an example of an absolute monarch? Define parliamentary monarchy, and where do we see this happening? Okay, so Europe is constantly fighting itself. You have constant internal and international wars. This is going to lead to the improvement of both the skill of European soldiers and the weaponry of the armies. So armies require organization, which is going to lead to better training, better navies, and ultimately this balance of power when European states formed alliances to keep any one state from becoming too powerful. So that's why you have lots of powerful states in Europe that are relatively small in comparison to like these ginormous states of the Ming or the Ottomans or the Mughals or the Safavids. The fact of the matter is war is really expensive, so you need more revenue. Merchants want to limit taxes, but also want the crown to enforce contracts and collect debts. So there's a tension here. So what do the different states do? Well, Spain goes for an aggressive military policy with no real economic development, which means Spain will default and declare bankruptcy 4 times during the reign of Philip II. The Spanish crown will ultimately be more concerned about religious uniformity and aristocratic privilege than the economy. They force out Jewish merchants and Muslim farmers. Aristocratic land is exempt from taxation. And so, because so little of the land's ultimately taxed, you don't have very many merchants, and a high sales tax, it discourages manufacturing. The economy in Spain sucks. However, they're going to be able to fake it for a little while because of all of the gold in Spain coming from the Americas, right? They're going to sort of create the illusion of wealth and a successful economy because of this influx. However, it simply leads to inflation across Europe. In the Netherlands, well, the Netherlands used to be ruled by Spain. They went to war. Netherlands are independent now. Because the Netherlands weren't ruined by military costs and they were more focused on trade and manufacturing, they are going to start a huge trading empire, and they are going to be England's greatest competition. So Dutch exploration owed much to the private initiative of merchant groups and the formation of chartered trading companies. The English and the French, meanwhile, are going to get involved in the national economies. So they will tax their wealthy landowners, collect taxes directly, and secure low-cost loans. But between the two, England did it better. So ultimately, the Protestant Reformation, the scientific revolution, will lead the way to the Enlightenment, which will lead to changes in social behavior. It will also mean an increase in trade, both foreign and domestic, and a rise in a wealthy commercial class, with Amsterdam being the best example of this. Agricultural improvements will increase production as well as the carrying capacity because of new crops from the Americas, and serfdom will be abolished. However, rural poverty will remain really significant. The Holy Roman Empire will decline in strength, in part because of the infighting from religious fragmentation. Spain and France will increase their centralized power with absolutist monarchies, and internal struggles over religious change and the relationships between monarchs and their peoples will also contribute to European disunity. Meanwhile, the English are increasing their naval power, establishing direct taxation and a central bank. This will make England stronger financially than the other European powers at the end of the 1600s. Okay, let's do a couple practice questions. So here are a couple sources, right? Images count as sources as well. Which of the following best explains the political purpose for the structures displayed in the images? Louis XIV's demonstration of his political power was a change from the previous period of 600 to 1450 in which of the following ways? Okay, a couple more sources. Pause it, read through them. One is a written source, one is a visual source. The ideas in source 1 will form the basis for which of the following political ideas in the 17th and 18th centuries. So remember, that's going to be the 1600s and 1700s. Which is the most likely reason that rulers during the 17th century in Europe built elaborate palaces, such as the one at Versailles, France, shown in source 2? All right. Please explain how rulers used a variety of methods to legitimatize and consolidate their power in Europe from 1450 to 1750. If you have any questions, please ask. Thanks for listening.